This is the Los Angeles Review of Books podcast. I'm Colin Marshall, speaking today with David Grand, the author of 3 novels, Louse, The Disappearing Body, and the brand new Mount Terminus, which takes place at the intersection of 2 births, you might say. One is the birth of cinema as we know it. One is the birth of Los Angeles as we know it. Now, I say Los Angeles, and reviewers talk about Los Angeles, and the jacket copy talks about Los Angeles. But David, tell me if I'm correct on this. The words Los Angeles are never mentioned in the text of the book, right?
Yes, that's right. Yes, I never used the words Los Angeles. There are some place names, throughout the novel that I think locate us in LA, but no, I don't use the words Los Angeles.
Now, what does it afford you to set a novel in a city that is Los Angeles, but is not named as Los Angeles?
Well, it gave me a great deal of freedom to invent my own version of LA. I think that one of the problems I've had writing about Los Angeles in the past is that, I grew up in LA. I moved there when I was 8 years old, and was there until I was in my mid-20s, which brings us to the mid-90s. And Los Angeles was always very difficult as a concept for me to tackle in fiction, because it's just such a huge, sprawling mass, and it's so diverse with so many different communities. And the only way that I could really kind of conquer it all in this big sweeping story that I tell was to sort of start peeling back those layers of history and to shrink the landscape and just to simplify it. So, that's essentially what I did. In my mind, the story takes place at the turn of the 20th century, when there was just that downtown area that was mostly developed along the Los Angeles River. And at least in my mind and the research that I did, so much of the, of the city to the west was largely untouched. So I don't know, I just found myself very comfortable with the silence and the pristine landscapes.
When did this vision of an empty Los Angeles first appeal to you, or first present itself to you even? It's not something, emptiness is just not a quality that we associate with Los Angeles now, of course. It's a word that comes up in the book, but what led you to first envision an empty, or nearly so, Los Angeles?
Well, I think there were a number of factors when I started conceiving the book. As I said, I wanted to tell a story set in LA, and then I became incredibly fascinated with the advent of the new cinema technology of that era. Going back to still photography, and even before that, I was looking at a lot of pre-cinematic history, and so when I started concentrating on those aspects of the story, on the technology of the day, I realized, here we have the birth of the art form that would fuel the economy of the city for now over a century, and then there's the birth of the city itself. There was that, I think, 1890s boom and bust in the real estate market. And then, it's not until Mulholland brings water to LA that the population, really starts to boom again.
Now, we have plenty of water issues to talk about, of course, here. But first, just on the cinema thing for a moment more. What is it? You mentioned the importance of cinema to Los Angeles. And from the time Mount Terminus is set until now, do you see this city, do you see Los Angeles as somehow continuously defined by the presence of the film industry? It seems like these days I rarely encounter it, and I live here. But do you see it differently? Do you see it as some part of the Los Angeles, at least of the imagination, that you can't take away?
Well, I mean, I mean, I can't speak. I can speak in. I'm not sure if I feel comfortable speaking in those general terms. I can tell you what it means to me.
Of course, please do.
Yeah. When I was a kid growing up in LA, I was fascinated with that aspect of LA. I used to play soccer in Rancho Park, and across the street I would see the tips of the facades, outside the gates of the Fox Studios. And and I used to go to Universal Studios when we would have family visiting, and we would take these tours. And really, that's, I didn't have much access to the industry beyond that. But somehow, in my childhood imagination, the studio backlot kind of, it expanded into the architecture of the city, into all of this kind of mismatched, mismatch of architecture, throughout the city. There was, there's this, there's this aspect of that LA was, was young and built up from the whims of new money, entering the city. So I don't know. I think my writerly imagination is oftentimes fueled by this idea, this fantasy that I have of the studio backlot. And I would even suggest that, if you look at my two earlier novels, they're also kind of like backlot novels. I like inventing these worlds that could kind of exist on a soundstage.
I like that a young person's imagination is such a part of that story you tell. I mean, in this case, it's your imagination that's filling in the details of what could be going on in these backlots in the city you're growing up in. Because the imagination of a young person is so important to Mount Terminus. The imagination specifically of the main character, known as Bloom. He of course gets involved in the film business as it develops in the Los Angeles, not called Los Angeles, that is also developing. It seemed to be coming to the end of his novel that that imagination was really the scarce substance in the world of this book. Water was scarce, but imagination, true imagination, seemed even harder to come by. Does that make any sense to you in terms of your novel, of the scarcity of imagination, something you might think about writing or reading this book?
It's something that I haven't really thought about, the scarcity of imagination, that is, but I did spend a great deal of time trying to develop the imagination of Bloom. But I do appreciate what you're saying. I mean, there certainly is a theme working through the novel of this of commerce and art going head to head to some degree. But I don't think I'd treat that in an over serious manner, but I do think that there is, that certainly does exist. But I think my efforts were mostly on creating the rich imagination of a complicated person, of a complicated character.
And it's a rich imagination. It's Bloom's rich imagination that Bloom's brother, Simon, applies to film. Simon is the businessman of the family, the mogul in training, the film mogul in training, you might say, or he soon becomes quite a film mogul. It's very much what we think of the early 20th century's Los Angeles film moguls, but he recognizes the value of Bloom's imagination, an imagination he's cultivated in this estate, Mount Terminus, up on the hill, overlooking essentially nothing for quite a while before this Los Angeles is built. And yeah, it could have been an old story, an old Los Angeles story of the imagination sort of exploited by the mogul. But yeah, it's not that. Reading your book, I was very relieved to find that it wasn't that. It's something more complicated. And I mean, I think of it this way: Simon the mogul, the family mogul, the half-brother, not long lost, but for a while there lost, or separated half-brother. I mean, he is not a classically unimaginative money man. He himself, he's imagining building Los Angeles, right? He's imagining something in a way even grander than Bloom imagines with his films. Is he not?
Yes, he does. I always, thought of Simon as being somewhat of a Renaissance man. And I realize that I make Simon, an incredibly intriguing character. I understand that there's been, quite a bit written about, maybe not developing, that aspect of the story or concentrating my efforts on Simon's character. But I did that very intentionally. I feel as if the story of the mogul, the story of the developer, no matter how fascinating, is a story that's overexposed, especially within the frame of Los Angeles and stories about Los Angeles.
And this applies in a few different directions, but Bloom's father invents a device or a component called the Rosenblum drive, which proves very important to early cinema. Without it, it seems, film could not be projected in a way that people could watch it and believe in the actions going on in front of them that are really just frame by one frame of light at a time. This mechanism, the Rosenblum drive, allows these images to move smoothly and believably, and it works very profitably for him, which means that Bloom is bequeathed the resources to be able to live in this estate, Mount Terminus, in some sense, if not fully literally at the beginning, in some sense walled off, certainly separated from the rest of society, such as it even exists in Los Angeles at that time. Do you see that kind of isolation as, how to put it, as something necessary for the kind of imagination Bloom has?
I don't know if it's necessary. I think it was necessary for Bloom, for Bloom's character.
He feeds off of that isolation in a way that some of us might really not.
Right. Well, I mean, the idea was when I started out was to construct a character who was very comfortable in that isolation. I don't know if Bloom even considers the isolation, a form of alienation, or if he would consider himself lonely in that space. I think he thrives, in that place of isolation. So when his father tells him that we're going to live a life apart at the beginning of the novel, I think that moment registers, but it's not coming as any form of punishment. I think Bloom is very comfortable in those quiet, pristine spaces, and of course, when Simon enters the fiction and the landscape starts to change and the world begins to develop, there's a growing sense of unease.
And there's something about this that resonates with at least the historical books I've read about the early development, at least the development in the early 20th century of Los Angeles, because there was so much boosterism going on, as you well know, with Los Angeles at that time, and much of the implication of the way Los Angeles was sold in the early 20th century seemed to be, here is a place where you can live in your own form of isolation. You can be in a city yet outside of society somehow. I mean, there was a sense in which Los Angeles then was pitched as a way for everybody to be their own version of Bloom, was it not?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think I began with that. I think I began with that, that general idea that earlier we were talking about, both, the isolation and why I felt compelled to write a story, set in an empty landscape, to sort of peel back the layers of history and wipe away the architectural development of the entire city. And I think it goes back to this this basic feeling I had when I was growing up, which was this blissful state of alienation I always kind of experienced when I was, when I was just driving around LA, and then later when I grew up and became more of an adult, and my friends were, say living in West Hollywood, and I was in, in Silver Lake, or living in the Pacific Palisades, we just felt so, so distant from each other. It felt like such a chore to get in the car and just, to kind of, create those kinds of intimate connections one needs, in their daily mundane life. And so it's like yes, on the one hand, you have all of this kind of open space afforded to you, and you have these beautiful landscapes, and there's the promise of just feeling that that kind of freedom one tends to feel in California, where you're just dazzled by the landscape and the weather and the light of Southern California in particular. But then there's that, that other aspect to life that I feel goes, incredibly unfulfilled. Now that was the, that was the kernel. But I very much wanted, my character Bloom to fit in into that space, into that open space, content with those feelings of isolation, and happy to, to grow into it.
The Los Angeles of your youth and the Los Angeles of Bloom's youth, and we never see him as anything but youthful, really. What is the same about those two Los Angeleses? Is it purely the geography, purely the light, purely factors like that, or is anything else retained from his Los Angeles to yours, the one you grew up in?
I think there's that there is a state of mind that I, that was my own, that I transferred to Bloom's character, most certainly. As I was saying earlier, I think LA is one of those wonderful landscapes to escape into, and I did more than my fair share of escaping, and with many different kinds of altered mindsets in my youth, and so it's a wonderful, LA was a wonderful place to be a young person, and just to experiment with not only recreational drug use but also identity. I think it's a place where you can travel from one part of town to the next and discover something completely different about yourself.
Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, this book takes place at the intersection of the birth of modern Los Angeles and the birth of cinema. And it seems to me now, after reading your book, there are so many resonances between the two. Of course, both of them, both Los Angeles and cinema, began first without any kind of reputation at all, and then with a sort of bad reputation, a low-class reputation. And they both became inescapable at a certain point. They both became not omnipresent, but they both became entities that one cannot not be aware of. I mean, do you see cinema in Los Angeles as developing in parallel in that way? But neither wholly escaped their reputation of being a bit too new and a bit too formless, but they both have achieved very, very distinctive types of, very specific, very distinctive types of respectability, haven't they?
Yeah, I'm not sure how comfortable I feel about, making big statements about the evolution of the film industry, because I'm not a film historian, and I am, I have some very basic ideas to, about that. But as far as LA goes, I'm kind of. I feel like it's an incredibly unique place. It's funny. I mean, I live in Brooklyn. I've been away from LA now for 20 years, and maybe this is why I can kind of appreciate the city.
Yes, you have to go away from any place to really appreciate it, don't you?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I remember, feeling that it never did quite take the form and shape that I wanted it to take when I was living there.
Which would be what form?
Just a place that's, easy to get around,
They're still working on it. I think it's coming along.
I remember, because I'm a walker. I like to walk, and just walking on the streets of Los Angeles and wanting to just encounter another human being, that would have been nice.
I can assure you it's improved now, but I don't know what it was like back then. So
back then there were certain neighborhoods you can go to, like, there was certain parts of Los Feliz, and Venice was always a fine place to walk around. And
yes, indeed, it's interesting because you mentioned at the beginning, of course, Los Angeles is not mentioned by name in Mount Terminus. Certain locations are. Quite a few of those locations, it seemed to me, were downtown streets. This was an era when downtown was kind of the only part of Los Angeles there was. Now it's, once again, very much a talked about part of Los Angeles. It has a lot of centricity back. When you were growing up, though, did you ever have to go downtown?
Yeah, I did go downtown.
Really?
When I was in my early 20s, I worked downtown in the gas company tower for I think 3 years.
So you're going every day?
Yeah, I was going every day. I was living in Silver Lake at the time, and I took the number 2 bus down Sunset to get to work. And
now, were you there after hours as well, or was this a leave downtown at 6 sharp situation?
Well, there was also a period of time that I was working at Gorky's restaurant.
Oh, yes, I love that you mentioned that, because whenever anybody says, no, downtown, I was in downtown, even in its emptiest days, they always have some Gorky's story. It's always about Gorky's.
Exactly. So, I would work at Gorky's late into the night, and
an occupation without its risks, as I understand it.
There were some interesting moments, for sure. So it was really nice to return to LA. I don't know if you've heard this, but when I was working on Mount Terminus, I found that my trips to Los Angeles were interfering with this image I had of this empty space, and so I stopped visiting. So I was away for almost 10 years, and I made my first trip back when I was touring with the book, first in March, and then I was back at the LA Times Festival. And I was really kind of pleased to see the way downtown had developed over those years. When I was away, I was kind of happy to see the concentration of just new businesses and people walking their dogs on the street.
Yeah, simple things.
Lots of restaurants popping up, and I found it to be really wonderful.
There's this sense of places, the version of a place you hold in your imagination, and you had the version of Los Angeles you needed to keep in your imagination during the 11 years working on Mount Terminus. And I can understand why visiting the real Los Angeles, the Los Angeles in the 21st century would interfere with that, would get in the way, would corrupt the image you needed to maintain to work on the book. I wonder, do you do the same thing with other places? I mean, did you have a New York of the imagination that you had constructed before you went there? New York is that's where I was born in New York, mm-hmm. and then I lived in New York when I was a child. So, and then my family is very New York. So New York was always this very real place to me. Mm-hmm. But I think on a every day,
whenever we live in big cities, I think we tend to romanticize them in one way or another, and create our own patterns of existence that are connected to those to those ideas, those romantic ideas we have about a place.
It's also a much romanticized time now, the early years of cinema. I mean, you have in Mount Terminus, you have Bloom sit down with, for example, it's like it's almost an early home entertainment system. Simon comes in with an actual projector to screen him, say, A Voyage to the Moon, these early films in the estate, trying to sell him on the idea of working for his motion picture enterprise. And it made me realize why that period would be sort of looked fondly upon by cinephiles now, because this was a time when film was so new, when the motion picture was so new as a medium, that it didn't really have a lot of established rules. Now, as just a film viewer yourself, are you particularly interested in the time when we didn't have, when the cliches of film hadn't been invented yet?
Yeah, I was very excited about this idea that it was a period when there was invention going on all the time. As you said, there were no rules or conventions. There were these people who were experimenting with what was seen as little more than a toy. In many ways, it reminds me of this period of time we're living through with digital media. There are just so many applications, or maybe not exactly in the present, but in the last 10 years, there just seems to have been this proliferation of wonderful things one never ever thought about, at your disposal, at your,
right.
in your hand, at your fingertips. So there's, I was very attracted to, both to the act of invention, creating a visual language, how the technology, helped bring out parts of, say, Bloom's imagination.
It's ironic, reading Mount Terminus. While I was reading Mount Terminus, this new novel that I was excited to read, I also ran across a recent article by, I think, Will Self, that got sent around quite a lot among readers of literary fiction anyways. His point in the article was, the novel's dead. I know it's been said before, but now it's dead for sure. And I realize, that you can get a lot of clicks to articles by pronouncing a form dead, the novel or or cinema or anything else. And people always talk about the death of forms, but I feel like now more than ever we should be seeing so many more celebrations, so many more heraldings of the birth of new forms, right? Why do people not talk about why don't they herald the birth of new forms? It seems like cinema had to go a long way before anybody celebrated it. I
don't know, the birth of new forms. Are you talking about within cinema, or are you
anything? I mean, as you say, now with technology the way it is in the past 10, 15 years, there has been a new proliferation of just forms of art, or whatever you want to call it, you can experience. But I still feel like people talk a lot more about what forms they think are dead than what ones that are clearly being born.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that there are... I think that there needs to be some cooling off period with forms, doesn't there? I mean, it takes a while for the public to cotton on to new forms before they feel comfortable with them, or I still think that even though we're in this this age of small d democratization in the arts and in writing, and I still think that people they have a tendency to look for reassurance from the traditional gatekeepers to say that some form is is enjoyable or is
Go ahead, you can
worthwhile.
enjoy this.
Yes, go ahead, you can enjoy it, please.
It's anointed.
Yes, at which point everyone, gets on the bandwagon and, I guess, forms a blog around it. I don't know.
But blog aside, is that what happened with cinema, where it had to have this cooling off period? Is it this? Do you envision the same thing, the same process that happened to cinema, where it gained acceptance with any of these new forms that may or may not be emerging today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the cinema of that era was, it was incredibly crude. Most of it.
True.
I think it was the rare exception that there was a short film that really touched people in a significant way. And I think I think that generally is what happens when new forms emerge. When you can truly engage with it, as a human being, and it can move you and help shape the way you think and alter your perception. I think that's when a new form really kind of takes root. And I think we began to see that in the teens in the teens and the 20s with these silent films. There are just some really beautiful ones out there.
It's often, there's often a word applied to them, that they are dreamlike. And I have so often read the Hollywood film industry called a dream factory. It's always those words, or especially in the first half of the 20th century, the Los Angeles Dream Factory, the Hollywood Dream Factory. And I always wondered why. I guess it makes sense on some instinctive level to call it that, but I never really understood why, although reading Mount Terminus, I did realize, though in the first few decades of cinema, the films really were dreamlike, but I feel like at a certain point that no longer applies. They stopped being like dreams, or did they? Do you think Dream Factory is still an applicable term for the film industry?
I suppose so. Maybe they're more lifelike. But then again, somehow I think that they're this combination of both, of reality and life and fantasy, or maybe they're just bringing fantasy to life. I'm very moved when I feel like I'm moving through space or time, or when I'm watching characters melt so realistically in front of me. I think we've gotten to the point where that the things that live inside of us, in both the darkest and brightest parts of us, are able to come to life through magic, through tricks of the screen, computer animation and graphics, and whatever these guys have in their bag of tricks. So yes, it is a dream factory. No, it's oftentimes it resembles life. I'm not quite sure I know exactly how to answer that question, but I do believe that at that time, motion pictures were truly a phenomenon. One thing that I discovered when I was doing my research was that human beings for a long time had a tendency to they enjoyed gathering in dark places and experiencing some form of life on the screen. In the novel, I do use the real name of this historical figure, Etienne Gaspard, who used to gather big crowds, and they would congregate in cathedrals, and he would put on these magic lantern shows that really did resemble modern day cinema. They would project images. They were still images, but they had minstrels and they had a narrator. And this was in the 1700s. So there's And then if you kind of go back deeper into history, we have, shadow puppets and, we have, Plato's allegory of the cave. So that there's really sort of nothing new about the idea of the dream factory, of our tendency to want to collectively dream.
And there is something particularly fascinating, now that I think about it, about the way that cinema has always mixed, or has always found a way to bolt together, shall we say, elements of real life and elements of fantasy, or I guess myth is maybe a better word for it. Because I was thinking about, as we mentioned, the importance of water in Mount Terminus, because Bloom's brother Simon, the mogul, wants to not just build the film industry, he wants to build Los Angeles, and he needs to get some water to do that. He needs to find a way to bring water down to irrigate what needs to be irrigated, to get plumbing where that needs to go. And of course, it's going to remind anybody who reads it of a motion picture of Chinatown, which also uses the story of how Los Angeles got the water it's needed in a way that is not really adherent to history, but it uses it to forge its own myth. What is so appealing about the history, Los Angeles' history with water, Southern California's history with water? What's so appealing about that as a sort of tool to forge myths of one's own?
Building a city where a city shouldn't be is sort of, kind of mythological in the in the truest sense. I think what William Mulholland did by building that aqueduct and bringing water to Los Angeles, to an arid coastal desert region, was superhuman in so many ways, and of course he paid for that later on in his life. That hubris nearly destroyed him. So just that there is that sort of superhuman feat to creating something in a place that shouldn't be really created. And I think that is part of the reason why I was attracted to telling that part of the story. But I'm also very interested in the artificial nature of that type of city. Sort of growing a city from whole cloth. It's something that we, I guess, see pretty regularly now in places like Las Vegas.
Yes, indeed, we've grown used to it.
Just you were talking about LA boosters and that period of boom. And constructing a place mostly from the imagination. I'm very interested in what goes into manufacturing a world like that. I don't see it being all that different from the type of worlds that are manufactured in the motion picture industry. But somehow I see the two of them being very much related.
Exactly. We've grown so used to both of them that we just take it for granted that, of course, a city like Los Angeles can exist because it existed before I got here. And, of course, motion pictures exist and feel real because they were doing that before I got here. But, they involved these types of water schemes. They involved these types of Rosenblum drives. Is there some sense in which you want to make surprising again these near mythological achievements that preceded us?
I did want to focus some attention on the excitement of that moment, and to write it in such a way that I think it's just so easy for us to take these historical moments for granted, and I'm hoping that I wrote about the birth of that technology in such a way that it gives you a little bit of a tingle and says, and you can kind of say to yourself, oh yeah, that's why this was so groundbreaking, and the same applies to to that monumental feat of bringing water to the desert to grow a city and attract people.
Now Bloom, as we say, he's not about to. He's certainly not the one in the family who founds cities, who founds industries. He, as we say, spends a lot of his early life in a kind of isolation. He later wishes for more isolation still. He fantasizes about scenarios where he's more removed from society, just surrounded by 3 or 4 of his closest people, and the walls are put up. And thinking back to your first novel, Louse, which has a reclusive, wealthy man who has made his own rules at its core, who's made a very specific system of rules. When you're thinking about history, does your imagination get drawn to his history's people of means who can set themselves apart, who can literally take themselves out of society? Is that process in and of itself fascinating to you?
Yes, I definitely, have a thing for, the Charles Foster Kanes of the world. I'm very much attracted to those kinds of figures, to the Howard Hugheses, to, figures like Mulholland and Goldman. These, but if we're talking about if we're talking about Louse, I was just fascinated by Hughes. I didn't, when I first started writing that novel, I knew very little about Howard Hughes. And one of the first things that I learned about him, I think I went to the Beverly Hills Public Library and checked out the controversial book about Hughes written by, was it Clifford Irving?
I think that's it. But it's in any case, yes, that there is a controversial book about him, and that was your first source.
Yes, that was my first source, and the thing that I went directly to were these extensive memos he wrote to his Mormon valets, and about what one must do when opening a can of peaches. And the memo went on for pages and pages, and I was just so fascinated by that obsessive compulsive state of mind. And then when I started reading deeper into his story, and I became familiar with the amount of history his life touched upon and how significant he was, for better or worse, within that history, I just thought, I don't care if he's a figure people have written about in the past. I want to write about this guy, but not from his point of view, but from the point of view of his manservant.
It sometimes takes, I don't want to say it takes no more than this, but getting an unconventional point of view on something often written about. In the disappearing body, like the Los Angeles that is not named Los Angeles of Mount Terminus. There you're using a New York that is not named New York. How else, when you're thinking about a city like New York, how else to get a perspective that is set enough apart to not repeat what's been said? If we're talking about written about cities, New York must rank very, very high.
Yes, and I think the New York of that novel, as I said earlier, I see, I see this trio of novels as kind of emerging out of that backlog that I was talking about before.
Yes.
And the disappearing body it's a very strange novel in many regards, because I was determined to take the New York of the 1930s, as I thought of New York from watching films set in New York in that period, and probably in the 40s, a lot of the noir set in New York. And then I also wanted to construct it as, as sort of like a 19th century social novel, as well as, some and I wanted it to come off like a bit of a Robert Altman film, because there are, I don't know how many characters there are in that novel. So that it was a big ambitious attempt to to capture the vibrant life of New York that I'm, that I experience every day at the same time. There were these other factors going into the equation as well.
It certainly is ambitious, and of course, Mount Terminus is ambitious, more ambitious even in a completely different way. I mean, it's much written about. Everybody mentions, I've already said it once, the book was 11 years in the making, and I want to get a sense of because I can't think of another form that one can spend 11 years on in that way. If you spend 11 years making a movie, you're officially an eccentric if you're a director who's doing that. Or if you're spending 11 years recording an album, that's even I think that I think of, I don't know why this is the one that comes to mind, but the Guns N' Roses album, everybody waited for a long time. I mean, they started thinking of Axl Rose as crazy for that and other reasons. But a novelist can spend 11 years and not, and it's almost, people will always admire that. It seems like, well, he certainly put the time in. Tell me what.
Or they can just, think that, you're crazy.
But does that happen? I feel like novelists don't get thought of as crazy for spending 11 years. Like a novel, especially one, I don't know. I'll put it this way.
No, I'm just joking. I understand exactly what you're saying. Well, Mount Terminus was certainly it was a big, big departure for me. I was determined to write a lyrical novel, dense, multi-layered. I'm talking about the language. I wanted the language to resonate on the page. I wanted every sentence to be what I considered rhythmic and pulsating with life. And I really didn't know how to do that. As we've been talking about Louse and the disappearing body, the styles are drastically different, and the sensibility that I brought to both of those books was very different. And as we've been saying, I was surrounded by silence and pristine landscapes, and in this world of Mount Terminus, and the big challenge for me was this sort of sustaining Bloom's interest in the natural world and the villa in which he and his father live, focusing on these minute aspects of his life, and so sort of trying to sustain that was really challenging. And so I would go in every day, and I would diligently write my 2, 3, 4 pages, and then the following day I would go in and I would revise those pages to about 2 or 3 sentences.
So it was an act of condensation every day.
Yes,
it was very strong condensation as well.
Yeah, so it was this act of condensation, and then unlike my 2 previous novels, when I got stuck in the story and didn't know where I was going, oftentimes I would sort of just write through that, and I would force myself to write through it until the right thing occurred to me. And when that happened, I would just step away and take a long walk and wait until until the right image or the right words would occur to me. I just became very patient with this process, and it became a form of meditation. It's funny when I got to the end of the process, and my editor said, "Okay, I think that's enough."
That's what he said.
I started to panic, because I'd been living in this space. I would wake up every morning in Brooklyn, and there I would be in the hills of Southern California, and it became this incredibly beautiful place in my mind that I really enjoyed going to. And so when, just just the mere suggestion of it being over, it kind of sent me into a panic. I'd fallen in love with Bloom. I'd fallen in love with the landscape, with even the changing landscape. With I'd fallen in love with the complications between Bloom and Simon, and was always trying to reconfigure their relationship to make it more tense, or to diminish the tension, or whatever. So I don't know. I imagine that this is the kind of thing that happens to mathematicians when they're when they're trying to solve a really complicated equation.
It sounds like the very same form of overcoming that they talk about. But this idea that you got hooked on your own landscape here, your own Southern Californian pre-Los Angeles landscape. There's a movie that Bloom works on for much of the later part of the book, based upon a grim story he finds evidence of right below his feet, where he's living. Now, was it The Death of Paradise or The Murder of Paradise? This movie was called.
Right, it's the Death of Paradise.
The Death of Paradise. And, reading that title, of course, anybody who's been reading a lot about Los Angeles will think of this standard narrative about Los Angeles, that, Los Angeles was Arcadian, it was paradisical, and it only took mankind to come in and cause its death, to murder. There's this post-Edenic way Los Angeles is described by many, not everybody, but I can't help but wonder if that Edenic Los Angeles is, because it's now out of living memory, essentially. Is this something we're all just imagining now? Is that Los Angeles we describe as once real, now ruined, also a Los Angeles of our imaginations?
Well, just to be clear, the death of Paradise in the novel. I always intended that to be the death of Bloom's paradise.
Yes, indeed.
So,
and he has a very specific paradise indeed.
Right. So, I suppose that it's inevitable that idea is going to resonate outward into the city itself. So is Los Angeles, I think I'm going to stick to this answer that Los Angeles has always been this artificial construct, and whatever idea of paradise one brings to it is a fantasy.
It's a fantasy, and it's also it's a fantasy supported by a kind of mythology, and I'm thinking more about we talked about the language of Mount Terminus and the time spent on the language, and the sense in which do you think that the sheer amount of time spent on the novel, or rather the fact that you're working on the novel over a relatively long period of time, that seems to lend a timelessness to the language. It seems to make it, and when I say a timelessness, I feel like when I talk about timeless language, that is the language of myth. There's a mythical feeling to the book itself. Was that a goal for you in any sense at all, to use the language of myth in Mount Terminus? The language that sounds like the telling of a myth, of a sort of grand myth, no pun intended.
It was intentional, and there's the language of myth, and there's also most certainly the cadences of biblical language built into the text, and I did want to speak to some kind of both universal truth and build a place in which these big events could take place.
Los Angeles is a place that seems to, I would say, enjoys its founding myths, but it's a place where myths or even degraded versions of myths, rumors and stereotypes stick in an unchallenged way. It's just anything said about Los Angeles seems to stick to it, and in a way, it's a city that is always in search of higher quality founding myths. I think that. Do you think that if the events of Mount Terminus, could the events of Mount Terminus indeed have been the real events that preceded modern Los Angeles? Of course, it's not true history. Of course, it is its own world. Of course, plenty of things happen on a scale and in a way they didn't happen in real life. But I feel like the real Los Angeles could have resulted out of all this. It seems in that sense plausible, yet also mythological. Does that make any sense whatsoever?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I do think that some of the history and some of the history in the book is very real. I mean, there was this migration of Jewish theatrical talent from the east to the west at around that time. You had these itinerant filmmakers kind of chasing the sun, as it were, and they ended up in Southern California for the light. You did have William Mulholland, bring water from the Owens River Valley to irrigate fields and feed water into plumbing, to support a larger population, and all of these things they happen simultaneously. And that region of the world, it was a certain kind of paradise for indigenous people for many years. So yes, there are all of those elements of the story. They are true, and they are plausible when thinking about the origin of the city. And then there's Bloom. And he is the filter through which the story is told.
And having asked about what remained between, or what you see as having remained from the Los Angeles of Mount Terminus, the Los Angeles of your own childhood, and indeed what carries over to the Los Angeles today, I wonder, when you're out at the movies today, what in cinema, what about cinema is recognizably descended from the cinema of Bloom's time, of Mount Terminus's time, of those experimental days before cinema had become cinema? What we're not using, presumably, we're not using the equivalents of Rosenblum drives anymore. It's all digital. But what about cinema is clearly, is there a clear through line to the cinema of Mount Terminus?
I don't know. No, I mean that's a question I haven't really I haven't thought about, and I'm trying to come up with an answer for you, but I just don't quite.
Well, there may be nothing. There may be.
Yes, maybe that's the answer. Nothing.
It's completely different than that early form. It has nothing in common with the. I mean, certainly.
I don't know about you, but I mean, I still get very excited walking into a proper movie theater.
Yes, of course.
Into a movie palace, as it were, waiting for the coming attractions, which I don't think they necessarily had in Bloom's day. But just that, I don't know, that cool, almost sacred space of a movie theater. When I was a kid, I lived first in Westwood and then West LA. And when I was a kid in Westwood, I mean, I don't know how many screens there were nearby. There must have been, 30 some odd screens.
Yeah, I've heard Westwood had like 35 movie screens in those days. Exactly.
And so I would go to the movies at least 4 times a week. And sometimes I would, sit through the same movie twice. And I just loved the escape of walking into a movie theater. I think that will never change.
I think it does remain, especially you're talking from New York. I'm talking obviously from Los Angeles. We're living in the last maybe 2 cities in the U.S. where there are a number of, as you say, proper movie theaters. Are we not?
Right. And, I think they're diminishing in New York. I think Los Angeles they don't treat their historic buildings well, but they do treat their movie theaters very well.
That's something in any case.
Yeah, exactly. So there's nothing like going to the movies in LA.
Indeed. I've been speaking on the Los Angeles Review of Books podcast with David Grand, the author of the new Mount Terminus, as well as the novels Louse and The Disappearing Body. David, thanks so much for taking the time. Thank
you so much for having me.
I've been Colin Marshall. Once again, this has been the Los Angeles Review of Books podcast. Keep up with me at colinmarshall.org and the LARB at lareviewofbooks.com. Thanks.